The dust swirled around the ramshackle cabin like the ghosts of better times, and Mary Catherine held her newborn twins closer to her chest as another wave of weakness washed over her. The babies, barely 3 days old, whimpered softly against her worn cotton dress. Through the single cracked window, she could see her husband Thomas pacing in the yard, his boots wearing a deeper groove in the hard, packed earth with each desperate turn. The drought had lasted 2 full years now, turning their once promising homestead into a monument to broken dreams. The cattle had died one by one, their bones now scattered across the barren pasture like white stones marking graves. The well had run dry months ago, and Thomas had to ride 5 miles each day just to bring back enough brackish water to keep them alive. The corn crop had failed completely, leaving them with nothing but a handful of withered stalks that mocked their efforts. Mary Catherine could hear Thomas muttering to himself outside, his voice carrying the edge of a man pushed beyond his limits. She knew that look in his eyes, had seen it growing darker with each passing week as their meager savings dwindled to nothing. Yesterday he had sold his father's pocket watch, the last thing of value they owned, for barely enough money to buy a sack of flour that would last maybe a week. The babies stirred against her, and she felt the familiar pang of knowing she barely had enough strength left to feed them. Her milk was thin and sparse, her body too weakened by months of near starvation to properly nourish the children she had brought into this harsh world. Little Sarah, the smaller of the twins, seemed especially fragile, her tiny chest rising and falling with an effort that broke Mary Catherine's heart. Through the thin walls, she heard the approach of horses and the low murmur of male voices. Thomas's pacing stopped abruptly, and she could imagine him straightening his shoulders, trying to summon whatever dignity remained to a man who had watched everything he worked for turn to dust. The voices grew clearer as they drew closer to the cabin, and Mary Catherine recognized the gravelly tone of Jake Morrison, the local cattle buyer who had been making rounds through the territory, looking for anything of value among the failing homesteads. Thomas's voice joined the conversation, but she couldn't make out the words. There was something different in his tone, though, something that made her stomach clench with a fear that went deeper than hunger. She shifted carefully on the narrow bed, trying to position herself where she might hear better without disturbing the babies, who had finally settled into an uneasy sleep. The conversation outside grew more intense, voices rising and falling like a negotiation. Mary Catherine caught fragments of words that made no sense together, something about payment, about taking care of problems, about desperate times calling for desperate measures. She heard Morrison's laugh, a sound like gravel in a tin cup, and then Thomas's voice again, quieter now, almost pleading. The cabin door opened with its familiar squeal of rusty hinges, and Thomas stepped inside, his face pale beneath the dust and stubble. Behind him came Morrison, a heavy-set man whose expensive clothes and well-fed appearance seemed obscene in the context of their poverty. Morrison's small eyes swept the interior of the cabin, taking in the bare walls, the single bed, the empty shelves that had once held their modest possessions. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes as he cleared his throat and began to speak in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away. He told her that Morrison had made an offer, a way out of their impossible situation. The man was heading west to California, where he had business interests and needed someone to help manage his household. It would mean leaving Texas, leaving behind everything they had tried to build, but it would also mean food and shelter for her and the babies. Mary Catherine felt the world shift around her as the true meaning of Thomas's words became clear. This wasn't about employment or opportunity. Morrison wasn't looking for a housekeeper or a nanny. He was looking to buy a woman, and her husband was desperate enough to sell her. The transaction was being dressed up in polite language, but the reality was as stark and brutal as the drought, cracked earth outside their door. Morrison stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil as he explained that he was a reasonable man, that he understood the difficulties facing families in these hard times. He spoke of his ranch in California, of the comfortable life she could have there, of the security he could provide for her children. But his eyes held no warmth, and Mary Catherine could see the calculation behind his words, the way he appraised her like livestock at auction. Thomas finally looked at her then, and she saw in his face the complete collapse of the man she had married 6 years ago. The young cowboy who had courted her with wildflowers and promises of a bright future was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. He spoke of the money Morrison was offering, enough to buy passage to Oregon where his brother lived, where he could start over. He spoke of it as if she would be part of that new beginning, as if they would somehow be reunited once his fortunes improved. But Mary Catherine understood what he could not bring himself to say directly. He was abandoning her and their children, trading them for the chance to escape the failure that consumed him. The money Morrison offered would buy Thomas a new life, while she would disappear into whatever plans the buyer had for her. She thought of all the stories she had heard of women who vanished into the territories, of wives and daughters who were sold or traded like goods and never seen again by their families. The babies began to stir, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, and little Sarah began to cry with the thin, desperate sound of a hungry infant. Mary Catherine held them tighter, her mind racing as she tried to find some way out of the trap that was closing around them. Morrison was watching her carefully now, waiting for her response, while Thomas stood by the door like a man preparing to flee. She asked for time to think to prepare the children for travel, but Morrison shook his head with the patient firmness of someone accustomed to getting his way. He had other business to attend to, he said, and couldn't afford delays. The transaction needed to be completed today or not at all. Thomas shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, and Mary Catherine realized that he had already made his choice. The woman he had promised to love and protect was now just another asset to be liquidated in his desperate flight from failure. As Morrison counted out silver dollars into Thomas's shaking hands, Mary Catherine felt something die inside her. Not just love for the man who was betraying her, but something deeper, her faith in the idea that people were fundamentally decent, that marriage meant something beyond convenience, that the promises made before family and community had weight and meaning. She watched the money change hands and knew she was witnessing the death of her old life and the birth of something she couldn't yet comprehend. The sound of approaching riders interrupted the grim transaction, and through the window Mary Catherine could see a small group of men on horseback approaching the cabin. Morrison cursed under his breath and moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. Thomas looked confused and frightened, clearly not expecting visitors and unsure how their presence might complicate his arrangement with Morrison. The lead rider was a tall man in a worn but well-maintained coat, his hat pulled low over weathered features. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and his companions followed suit. There was something in their bearing that suggested they were not ordinary travelers, and Morrison's reaction told Mary Catherine that their arrival was not welcome news for the cattle buyer. The stranger knocked on the door with polite firmness, and when Thomas opened it, he touched his hat brim in greeting to Mary Catherine before addressing the men. He introduced himself as Samuel Hartwell, a federal marshal investigating reports of illegal trafficking in the territory. His voice was calm and measured, but Mary Catherine caught the steel beneath the courtesy as he explained that he had been tracking certain individuals who were involved in the buying and selling of human beings under the guise of legitimate business transactions. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he attempted to bluff his way through the confrontation, claiming that he was simply offering employment to a family in need. Marshal Hartwell listened politely to his explanation, then asked to see the paperwork for this employment arrangement. When Morrison couldn't produce any legitimate contracts or documentation, the marshal's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more focused and dangerous. The marshal explained that he had been following reports of women and children disappearing from failing homesteads throughout the territory, sold by desperate husbands and fathers to men who took them to remote locations where they were never seen again. Some were forced into prostitution, others into unpaid labor little different from slavery. It was a trade that fed on desperation and flourished in the lawless spaces between established settlements. Thomas began to stammer protests, claiming he didn't understand what was happening, that he was just trying to find a way to care for his family. But the marshal's steady gaze seemed to strip away his pretenses, and gradually the full scope of what he had been about to do became clear to him. Mary Catherine watched her husband's face crumble as he realized he had been willing to sell his wife and children to a man who might have killed them once they were no longer useful. Morrison made a sudden move toward his gun, but he was facing 3 armed marshals who had clearly anticipated such a response. Within seconds he was disarmed and in custody, his protests about his rights and his important business connections falling on deaf ears. Marshal Hartwell informed him that he would be transported to the territorial capital to face charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, and fraud. As the marshals prepared to take Morrison away, Marshal Hartwell turned his attention to Thomas and Mary Catherine. His manner was less harsh when he addressed them, acknowledging the desperate circumstances that had led to this moment. He explained that Thomas could face charges as well for his role in the attempted sale, but that the law recognized the difference between those who preyed on desperation and those who were driven to desperate acts by circumstances beyond their control. The marshal offered them a choice. Thomas could face trial and almost certain conviction, which would mean prison and would leave Mary Catherine and the children with no support at all. Or he could accept an alternative arrangement that the marshal was authorized to make in cases like theirs. There was a family in Colorado Territory, friends of the marshal who had lost their own children to disease and were looking for a way to rebuild their lives by helping others. The Weatherbys were prosperous ranchers who had specifically asked the marshal to help them find a family in need, someone they could assist without charity but through genuine partnership. They needed help managing their large operation and were willing to provide housing, wages, and a chance for a fresh start. But they were particular about the kind of people they wanted to help. They insisted on families that were still intact, still committed to working together despite whatever hardships had brought them low. Marshal Hartwell looked directly at Thomas as he explained this option, making it clear that it would require the young man to prove himself worthy of such an opportunity. Thomas would need to work harder than he ever had in his life to demonstrate the kind of character that could rebuild trust and earn the respect of people who had no reason to help him beyond their own generous natures. The alternative was stark and clear. Thomas could continue down the path he had chosen, abandoning his family and trying to start over alone in Oregon. But he would do so knowing that his wife and children would be left with nothing, in a territory where single women with babies faced almost impossible odds of survival. The marshal made no attempt to sugarcoat the likely outcome of such a choice, describing in detail the fate that awaited women without protection or resources in the harsh realities of frontier life. Mary Catherine watched her husband struggle with the choice, seeing the war between his instinct for self-preservation and whatever remained of his conscience and honor. She realized that this moment would define not just her future, but the kind of man Thomas would become. He could choose to be someone who abandoned his responsibilities when times got hard, or he could choose to be someone who fought for his family, even when the odds seemed impossible. The silence stretched out until little Sarah began to cry again, her thin wail cutting through the tension in the cabin like a knife. Thomas looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time since the twins had been born, and Mary Catherine saw something shift in his expression. The defeated man who had been ready to sell his family began to straighten his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of determination that had been absent for months. Thomas accepted the marshal's offer, acknowledging his failures and expressing his willingness to do whatever was necessary to make things right. He asked Mary Catherine if she could forgive him, if she would be willing to try to rebuild their life together under the watchful eyes of strangers who had no reason to trust them. His voice broke as he spoke, and Mary Catherine could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the recognition of how close he had come to destroying everything that mattered. Marshal Hartwell explained that the journey to Colorado would be difficult, especially with newborn babies, but that he and his men would provide escort and assistance. The Weatherbys had sent money for supplies and travel expenses, understanding that the family they were helping would arrive with nothing but their willingness to work and their commitment to starting over. They had also sent a letter, written in Martha Weatherby's careful hand, welcoming them to what she hoped would become their new home. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had witnessed both their hopes and their near destruction, Mary Catherine felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was grief for the dreams they were leaving behind, anger at the circumstances that had brought them to this point, and fear of the unknown future that awaited them. But there was also something else, something she had not felt in months, a fragile, tentative hope. The journey to Colorado Territory took 3 weeks, traveling slowly to accommodate Mary Catherine's recovery and the needs of the babies. Marshal Hartwell proved to be a kind and patient escort, sharing stories of the territory they were crossing and the people they would soon meet. He spoke of Jonathan and Martha Weatherby with obvious respect and affection, describing their generosity to struggling families and their reputation for fairness in all their dealings. Thomas rode mostly in silence during the long days, wrestling with his thoughts and gradually coming to terms with the full scope of what he had almost done. Mary Catherine could see him changing during the journey. The desperate selfishness that had nearly destroyed them being replaced by a grim determination to prove himself worthy of the second chance they had been given. He took on every hard task during their travel, caring for the horses, standing watch at night, and doing whatever he could to ease the burden on his wife and children. The Weatherby Ranch sprawled across a wide valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with good grass and clear water that seemed like a miracle after the drought-stricken wasteland they had left behind. The main house was substantial but not ostentatious, speaking of prosperity earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. As their wagon approached, Jonathan and Martha Weatherby emerged to greet them, their faces showing the careful hope of people who had been hurt by life, but refused to let that hurt make them cynical. Martha Weatherby was a woman in her 40s, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes marking her as someone who worked alongside her husband rather than simply managing a household. She moved immediately to help Mary Catherine from the wagon, her experienced hands gentle as she took little Sarah and examined her with the practiced eye of someone who had raised children of her own. Her verdict was encouraging. The babies were small but healthy, and with proper nutrition and care they would thrive. Jonathan Weatherby was a tall, lean man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent working under the western sun. He shook hands with Thomas firmly but without warmth, making it clear that trust would have to be earned rather than granted. He explained the terms of their arrangement in straightforward language. Thomas would work as a ranch hand and eventually as a supervisor if he proved capable, while Mary Catherine would help Martha with the household and whatever other tasks her health permitted once she had recovered from childbirth. They would be provided with a small but comfortable house on the ranch property, along with wages that would allow them to gradually build some savings and security. The Weatherbys made it clear that they expected hard work and absolute honesty, but also that they believed in giving people the chance to prove themselves. They had built their own success through determination and mutual support, and they were willing to extend that same opportunity to others who shared their values. The months that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of Mary Catherine's life. Thomas threw himself into ranch work with a dedication that surprised everyone, including himself. He learned quickly and worked longer hours than anyone expected, driven by his determination to prove that the man who had nearly sold his family was not the man he intended to be. Jonathan Weatherby remained cautious, but gradually began to show signs of approval as Thomas demonstrated both competence and reliability. Mary Catherine found in Martha Weatherby not just an employer but a friend and mentor. The older woman had suffered her own tragedies, the loss of 3 children to scarlet fever and a miscarriage that had left her unable to have more, but she had channeled her grief into caring for others. She taught Mary Catherine skills she had never had the chance to learn, from preserving food and managing supplies to basic medical care and midwifery that would make her valuable to the entire community. The twins thrived in the mountain air and with regular meals, growing strong and healthy under Martha's experienced care. Sarah, who had seemed so fragile in those desperate days in Texas, developed into a bright and active child, while her brother Samuel showed signs of the same determination that was gradually transforming his father. Mary Catherine often found herself watching them play in the ranch yard and marveling at how different their lives had become. As the seasons changed and their first year in Colorado drew to a close, the Weatherbys made an offer that surprised and moved both Thomas and Mary Catherine. They proposed a partnership arrangement, offering to help Thomas establish his own small ranch on a section of their land. It would mean years of additional hard work and financial sacrifice, but it would also mean the chance to build something of their own again, to create a legacy for their children that went beyond mere survival. The proposal came with conditions that reflected the hard-won wisdom of people who had seen both success and failure in the unforgiving landscape of the American West. Thomas would need to demonstrate continued reliability and judgment, while Mary Catherine would need to show that she could manage the practical aspects of running a household and small operation. But the Weatherbys had seen enough in the past year to believe that this young family had learned the lessons that failure had taught them, and were ready to apply those lessons to building something better. On a clear morning in late spring, with the twins taking their first uncertain steps in the ranch yard and Thomas preparing to begin work on their own small house, Mary Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate woman who had clutched her newborn babies while her husband negotiated to sell her seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone she could barely recognize as herself. She thought about Morrison, now serving a long prison sentence for his crimes, and wondered how many other families had been destroyed by men like him who preyed on desperation. She thought about Marshall Hartwell, who had appeared at exactly the right moment like an answer to prayers she had been too frightened to voice. Most of all, she thought about the choices that had brought them to the edge of disaster, and the different choices that had pulled them back from that edge. Thomas joined her on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. He was different now, worn by hard work but strengthened by it as well, his face showing the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing he had faced his worst self and chosen to become something better. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the desperate edge that had characterized those dark months in Texas. He apologized again for what he had almost done, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he needed her to know that he understood the full weight of his actions. He spoke of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become, of the debt he owed not just to her and their children, but to the Weatherbys and to Marshall Hartwell, who had given them all a second chance. Most importantly, he spoke of his commitment to ensuring that they would never again face the kind of desperation that had nearly destroyed their family. Mary Catherine listened to her husband's words and felt the last of her anger and hurt begin to ease. She had learned that forgiveness was not something that happened all at once, but something that grew gradually, like trust, through daily choices and consistent actions. Thomas had earned that forgiveness through months of proving that his remorse was genuine and his commitment to change was real. As they sat together watching their children play in the fading light, Mary Catherine realized that their story had become something different than she had ever expected. It was not the simple tale of young love and frontier dreams that she had imagined when they first married. Instead, it was a more complex story about failure and redemption, about the ways that desperate times could reveal both the worst and the best in people, and about the power of second chances when they were coupled with the determination to make the most of them. The twins called to them from the yard, their voices bright with laughter as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Samuel had managed to catch one of the glowing insects and was holding it carefully in his cupped hands, his face illuminated by its gentle light. Sarah clapped her hands in delight, and Thomas and Mary Catherine moved to join their children in their simple joy. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Colorado mountains and the warmth of the family they had nearly lost, Mary Catherine understood that they had been given something precious and rare. Not just a second chance, but the wisdom to recognize it and the strength to make it count. The woman who had once been sold for hunger had become someone who could never be bought or traded because she had learned her own worth, and the man who had once been willing to sell his family had become someone who understood that some things were more valuable than money or comfort, or even survival itself. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of possibilities. They would build their small ranch together, raise their children to understand both the harsh realities and the unexpected kindnesses of frontier life, and create a legacy that would honor the people who had helped them when they needed it most. And someday, when they encountered their own families in desperate circumstances, they would have the chance to extend the same kind of grace that had saved them from their darkest moment. As the stars appeared one by one in the clear mountain sky, Mary Catherine held her husband's hand and watched their children discover the magic of fireflies, knowing that they had all found their way home.